Good afternoon. Welcome to the first lecture of the 2024-2025 Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series. And I'm incredibly privileged to be here with you this day. My name is Fouad Abdelkhaliq. I'm Provost and Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. And we're looking forward to today's lecture on future foods, how modern science is transforming the way we eat, presented by David Julian McClements, professor in the Department of Food Science. So before we turn it to Professor McClements, I would take a moment to explain how we're going to do this today. Professor McClements will give his remarks. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, and then we will present Professor McClements with the Chancellor's Medal, which is the highest honor that can be bestowed on UMass people at UMass Amherst. And then at the conclusion of the event, after you have some food for thought, we have some food for the belly, and so we're going to go down and have a reception, and you're all invited to join us. It now is my distinct privilege to introduce Dean Michael Fox, who's Dean of the College of Natural Sciences. He was appointed as Dean of the college in August 2023. He is a fabulous leader on this campus. His research focuses on the study of the cellular and molecular mechanisms that underlie neural circuit formation in the developing brain, and he's deeply committed to building an inclusive campus community. Dean Fox, would you please introduce our speaker?
Well, it's really an honor to be here today. I'm so thankful that we have such a big crowd. It's just wonderful to get to introduce Professor McClements, a distinguished professor here at UMass Amherst. He arrived here in 1994 after training at the University of Leeds in the UK, and then postdoctoral fellowships at University of California at Davis and University College Cork in Ireland. And I saw some of that was up there as I was sitting there. So he's been here for just over 30 years, and he has had an absolutely remarkable career here at UMass Amherst, and really has helped push our food science department to be the premier food science department in the nation. And so, I think a lot of that is on his shoulders, and we're certainly grateful for that. His research is focused on food nanotechnology and delivering systems for active ingredients in food, on engineering healthier processed foods, and more recently on creating the next generation of plant-based foods. He's been consistently funded by the USDA, the Good Food Institute, NASA, and a number of industry partners, including PepsiCo and Nestle. His scholarly contributions are vast, truly vast, with over 1,600 published works in research journals, somewhere between 10 to 20 books. He is also, in addition to doing that, he serves on a number of editorial boards, but he's also the editor, the sole editor of the annual reviews in food science and technology. Clearly, he has made and continues to make a tremendous impact on his field. Impact can be measured in a number of ways. We use citations, we use invitations for presentations or symposia, we use awards, honors, adjunct appointments, and even international collaborators. Check, 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 check. As just one example of these, over the last 3 years, his works have averaged 20,000 citations per year. It's truly remarkable. And of course, because of that, it's not surprising that he has repeatedly been listed in the Clarivate most highly cited researchers in food and agricultural sciences many times. He's been honored as an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry, the American Society for Chemistry, and the Institute for Food Technologists. And I could spend the entire hour talking about all of the awards that he's won. So as I said before, it's truly a remarkable set of accomplishments. His work has been transformative for UMass Amherst, for the College of Natural Sciences, and for the Department of Food Science. So it's truly a pleasure to get to introduce Professor McClements.
Wow. Thank you for that amazing introduction to the Provost and the Dean. It's fantastic to hear that. And I'm really honoured to receive this award. Even though the title's on sort of future foods, I'm going to, because this award is for the work I've done over the last 30 years, I'm going to give like an overview of some of the things I've done in my career. So it's going to be like a greatest hits album. And I'll focus a little bit at the end on some of the work we're doing on sort of future foods and plant-based foods. And I'm not going to go into any sort of real depth, scientific depth. I'm going to look at, sort of some of the, give an overview, because a lot of you might not be familiar, with what food science is and the different areas that you can work in. And what I want to do is I try and highlight some key moments in my career that really changed the direction that my work moved in, and and just so that you can look for these kind of opportunities in your career, and hopefully this can help you develop as a scientist as you move on. So as the Dean was saying, I started at the University of Leeds, and I did my undergraduate and PhD in Leeds, and then I went on to do postdocs in California and then in Ireland. And during my career, I've worked in a whole series of different areas, and I've absolutely loved working in the food science area. I've never got bored doing food science. There's always some really, really interesting challenges to work on. So anybody who's in the food science department, you're in a great career. And if you're not, you should try and do food science. We need more chemists and physicists and biologists doing food science, and neurologists neuroscientists doing this area. So I'll talk about, some of the things, I've worked on in the past. So where did I get my academic inspiration? Why did I become a scientist? It was really due to my Uncle Don. So nobody in my family had ever been to higher education before. And my Uncle Don went to do food technology in a sort of polytechnic in Grimsby, which is in the sort of part of northern England. And, he was really into science. He had all these science magazines and American comics, and I used to read them, and that really inspired me to do science. And I can remember, sitting with my uncle watching the moon landing. So he let me stay up late, so it was really late in England. And that really inspired me to do science. And again, I've never regretted that. So why did I become an academic? When I was doing my undergraduate studies, I worked in a food factory which was based in the town where I live. So I come from a town called Billingham, which is in the northeast of England. It's a real sort of working class city, and it's famous for the chemical work. So there's a big chemical industry called ICI based there. And they have this factory which makes all the potato chips or crisps in England called KP Foods. And I used to do night shifts there. So I used to set the blades to the right thickness so they could cut the chips up. And I'd come home and all my hands were covered in blood because I would always do it wrong and cut on my fingers. And it was hot, and it was there was frying oil everywhere. And after I'd finished that, I realized I don't want to work in the food industry. It's too much hard work. I want to become an academic. So instead of going to work in the food industry, I stayed in academia and started to do a PhD. And this was me getting my PhD in probably 1989. So I was looking much younger then. Had much nicer, thicker hair at the time. And my PhD was on ultrasonic spectroscopy. And it was something I'd never heard of at the time. So when I went to talk to my professor, and he said, I said, well, what am I working on? He said, well, what I want you to do is, take sound waves and bounce them off foods and get information about the internal structure of foods. So basically, you were taking a speaker, firing sound waves at food, and then using a microphone to measure the sound that came off. And by analysing the sound that came off, you could get information about the size of the particles or the concentration of the particles or whether they were solid or liquid. And that seemed really weird, how can you use sound to characterize food? But if you look in nature, this is what dolphins and bats do all the time. Dolphins send out ultrasonic waves and they bounce them off the fish, and they can tell where the fish are and how the fish are swimming around, and then they can catch the fish and eat it. So they're using ultrasound to catch their prey. And the same with bats, they're using sonic waves. So as they fly around the caves in the dark, they use sound to detect insects. So I was only doing something that was already being done in nature. I don't know if this is going to work. There we go. So what I had to do is I had to develop my own sort of microphone and speaker system in order to characterize these foods. So one of the first things I did is I built a custom-made ultrasonic spectrometer where you generated an electrical pulse, you converted it into a sound wave, you fired it through the food, and then you could measure the properties of the food. So we could measure the things like how quick the sound travels through the food, or how much it was attenuated. And then you've got data out like this, where you could measure, say, the velocity, though, the speed that the sound travels through something like an emulsion, like a salad dressing, and looked at how it changes with the fat content. So as the fat content increases, the velocity decreases. So if I measure the ultrasonic velocity, I can measure the fat content of this product. You know, and that was already good. That was very empirical, and you know, I could use this technique to try and characterize the food products. But what I found is, like, my results were really inconsistent, and I didn't know why. So I talked to my professor, and he came up to me and he gave me this scientific paper from like the 1970s, and he said, "This is what you need to solve the problem." And I looked at it and thought, "Oh my God." I mean, I was trained as a food scientist. I had no clue about maths. I never did maths since I was like 18. I had no clue about computers. And there was this like 12 by 12 complex simultaneous equation that I needed to solve in order to interpret my data. So I bought an engineering book, I bought a maths book, I bought a computer book, I learned the computing, I learned the maths, and then I programmed all this mathematical theory, and I actually got it to work. So this is like one of my, I think my proudest achievements as a scientist was actually getting this to work. And what was interesting about this was actually from a group of scientists in Massachusetts. So, you know, this was a defining moment in my career that I came back to Massachusetts. And this is some experiments I carried out where I compared my mathematical model to the experimental measurements I made, and it actually fit really well. And once I had this theory, I could understand what was, what affected the ultrasonic measurements. Then I could use it for prediction as well. And we could actually use this model to develop a spectrometer where we could measure the size and concentration of particles inside these food products. And then the company who sponsored this research was Unilever. So they were a big margarine manufacturer in England. And they were really excited about the work that we'd done. And then we actually built an online sensor that they fitted into their factory. So as the margarine was flowing through the plant, the information was going to a computer, and then it could change the processing conditions in order to sort of standardize the products. So this was 40 years ago, so I'm not sure if they're still using this, but you know, it was really exciting that the work that you were doing actually had some practical significance. So I learned a lot from my PhD. You know, I learned the importance of theory. If you can, always try and find a theory to understand your data. And I learned the importance of practical applications and the importance of perseverance. Sometimes things seem really, really hard, but if you focus on it and really work on it, you can solve it. Here we go. So after I left Leeds, I went to California, and that was a real nice shock. I remember waking up, I remember one night I was like in a jacuzzi outside my apartment, looking at the stars, drinking a cocktail, and think, this is not Northern England. Like, Northern England just rained all the time, it was grey and ugly. So I thought I've definitely come to the right place. But I spent about 2 years there, and then my visa ran out, so I had to leave the country for tax reasons. And then I went to Ireland and worked there for a year. And both UC Davis and the University College Cork really focused on dairy products. So I learned a lot about proteins and fats in dairy products and looking at natural ingredients. So we did a lot of work on sort of milk proteins. And that was really useful. And again, advice for young scientists. If you're doing a PhD, like, try and do a postdoc that's different, slightly different from what you did your PhD in, because you learn more skills. And if you go on to the next job, you've got more knowledge that you can use. So when I started as a professor, I had a whole series of different things I could work on, not just one very narrow thing. So when I got to UMass, I started focusing on food emulsions. So these are like tiny, in this case, fat droplets that's suspended in water. And lots of the food we eat are food emulsions. So things like salad dressings and mayonnaise and sauces and beverages are all got fat droplets in water. And I did a lot of work trying to understand, again, using mathematical models, what determined the stability and the appearance and the rheology and other important characteristics of these systems. And I ended up writing a book on this area. And the reason I wrote a book on it is because I was terrified about teaching. And I couldn't remember the lecture. So I wrote all my lectures down and then turned them into chapters for this book. But that was really, really good for me. I think, first of all, it forced me to learn the area really well. So I became an expert in food emulsions. And then it got my name out there as well. So then people in industry who bought this book could come to me and they might give me funding because of this book. So again, if you're a young faculty member, I would always recommend try and write a book because you learn a lot yourself and because it gets your name out there. So I was doing that for years, like doing all this food emulsions work. And then one day I was at my office in Chenoweth and I got this phone call from this guy called Eric Bonneboe. And it's one of those completely out of the blue phone calls that I didn't expect. And he was saying, I've got this money from NASA and I'm getting a group of scientists and chefs together. And what we're trying to do is create a food replicator. So I don't know, does anybody watch Star Trek? Yeah. So on the Starship Enterprise, they had this food replicator. So this was like you could type in the kind of food you wanted and it would sort of create this food product. So for me, when I was not a vegetarian, it would be like roast beef and Yorkshire puddings or something like that. Or a rhubarb crumble that my granny used to make. And he assembled this whole interesting group of people. We had like the commander of the International Space Station. We had Harold McGee, who wrote the Bible of science and cooking. We had a molecular gastronomy chef who had a TV program. And then a group of scientists were there as well. So it was a really interesting meeting. And they had some engineers there as well who were trying to develop this sort of food replicator. And I remember driving back to Amherst and thinking, that's a crazy idea, this is never going to work. Absolutely stupid. And then, now you can do it. Now that was a whole restaurant in London that actually has like a food replicator. So they use 3D printing, where they print all of the chairs, they print the tables, they print the menu, they print the food. So everything is 3D printed in this restaurant. But we just found out in my class last week that it's actually closed now. So it was a great idea, but it didn't last very long. And after poo-pooing it and saying it's never going to work, we've actually got a 3D printer that we use in my lab now. And we've been using it to try and create sort of 3D printed meat products or other kinds of plant-based food products. And I actually got featured in Japanese Vogue for this work. So that when I started my career, I never thought that I would appear in Japanese Vogue. But there we are, and it was talking about some of the work we were doing in 3D printing of sort of meat products. But this meeting, it was like a really critical part in my career. Is it really changed the way I thought about science. It made me think of foods in a very different way. So instead of just trying to understand the properties of food, I was trying to think of foods like building foods from the bottom up. So like looking at the analogy between architecture and food architecture. So for architecture, you build buildings to a certain plan. And you need to understand, you've got certain building materials, you need to understand their properties, you need how to put them together. And it's the same with foods. You've got building blocks, which are like proteins and fats and carbohydrates and particles. You need some structural engineering principles, and then you need to create a structure. So this is the approach that I've taken for probably like the last 10 or 20 years now, is this sort of food architecture approach. So the important thing about that is like always keep your mind open for good collaborations. Sometimes you collaborate with a group of people who think very differently from you, and it really changes the way you think about your own work. And that can take you into a different direction that can be really, really productive. So, my work was working with food emulsions, and I was just doing conventional food emulsion work. But after that idea of food architecture, what I tried to do is like, can I design these very small particles using these food architecture approaches? So creating novel structures at the nanoscale or micron scale to get improved functionality in foods. So we were trying to encapsulate different ingredients like vitamins and minerals and nutraceuticals and probiotics in these different types of particles. And so that they could be incorporated into foods, they would stay stable, and they would be bioavailable after we consumed them. So we created a whole series of different types of designed objects using this sort of food architecture approach. And I'll just give you like 1 or 2 examples. So this is from like my greatest hits of things that we've done. And this is trying to create delivery systems to try and protect things in the stomach. So there's lots of ingredients that we put in foods that can get damaged as they travel through the gastrointestinal tract. If you look at the gastrointestinal tract, it's this very complicated, soft machine made out of flesh. And you know, as things travel through it, you've got to go through the stomach, which is highly acidic, and it's got lots of different enzymes there. So lots of the things you want to put in there can get killed or deactivated. So if you're trying to fortify foods with things like probiotics to help your health, or enzymes or nutraceuticals, they can get chemically degraded or they can die of the bacteria in the stomach. So what we wanted to do is develop a delivery system that could protect these things. So again, like one of the things I loved when I was younger was reading American comics and watching science fiction films. And this was one of the films I watched in the like 1970s when I used to stay at my granny's house. So it was called The Fantastic Voyage. And in this one, what they did is they took some people and they shrunk them to a really, really tiny size, and then they put them in this tiny little spacecraft thing, and it travelled through the bloodstream of this mad scientist who had a brain problem, and they were trying to get these scientists into the brain, but you had to protect them from all the body's defense systems. So we were trying to do the same thing. We're trying to develop these little tiny craft to put probiotics in. So we've got these little living creatures, and we want to put them into some kind of delivery system and get them to travel through the stomach, through the small intestine, into the colon. And when they get to the colon, the little machine opens up and lets out the bacteria. So instead of having our little spacecraft, we have these things called microgels. So these microgels are a few hundred micrometers big, and they're usually made from food ingredients, so usually polymers. So in this case, this is made out of seaweed polymer. So it's a polymer called alginate. And we can make these polymers using a technique, it's an injection technique where we mix the polymer with the probiotics in a liquid, and then we just drip it into a solution of calcium, and that cross-links the polymers and forms these little particles. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to create particles that were going to protect the probiotics in the stomach. But the pH in the stomach is about pH 3. So what we wanted to do is, could we create a little particle where we can keep the pH neutral inside the particle, even though it's acidic outside? We wanted to be able to measure the pH inside this particle. And these are so small, you can't put a pH probe in them. So we had this sort of special tiny micro pH probe, which is a fluorescent dye. So we put this dye inside of here, and the colour of this dye tells you the pH, so we could measure the pH inside here. And then we put our probiotics in a control system, which is just the seaweed polymers, or we put it in the probiotics with this antacid. So, and the antacid is there to protect the probiotics from acids in the stomach. So then we used our sort of micro pH meter to measure the pH inside inside these microgel beads. And you can see if we put an antacid or buffer in there, so that's this system here, the pH stays at neutral. So the pH stays neutral even though it's in the stomach. If you don't put that in there, the protons, so the H plus, diffuses into these beads very quickly, and the pH decreases very quickly. So you get an acidic pH inside of here, and this kills all the probiotics. But if you have the antacid there, when the protons diffuse in here, this magnesium hydroxide dissolves, and it neutralizes the system. So we maintain this sort of neutral pH. And then we used it to look at the the viability of these probiotics in the gastrointestinal tract. So this is before consuming in the stomach and the small intestine. You can see if you don't encapsulate the probiotics, they all die. If you encapsulate them in the seaweed polymers, they still die because the protons can get inside here very easily, and you get acid inside here. But if you encapsulate them in our antacid-loaded microgels, you keep the viability of the probiotics, so you protect them. So you can see here, if you don't encapsulate them, they all die very quickly in the stomach. But if you encapsulate them, they stay viable. So then they can go to the colon, and they can get released, and then they can have this beneficial effect on the colon. So I talked about dolphins before during my PhD. Like we had, dolphins use ultrasound to determine their food, but I was back at dolphins again after this project. So after we published this paper, somebody telephoned me and said, "Do you want to do a project with dolphins?" And I said, "What?" And he said, like, there's these dolphins that the military uses to detect mines in the ocean, and they get sick really easily. So we want to feed them probiotics to make them healthier. But the probiotics get killed in the dolphin stomach. So we actually wrote a grant together to the military to try and get some funding for this. Unfortunately, it didn't get funded. But it was interesting to be back at the dolphins again. So another area which was related to this sort of food architecture area was working in food nanotechnology. So this was like a really hot topic from like the probably the year 2000 onwards. And what this is like you take food ingredients and you reduce the size to make them very, very small. So you make them like nano size. So these particles might be relatively large normally in food, but if we make them smaller, they behave very differently. And this was like another one of those films I used to watch at my granny's house in the summer holidays, this one called Incredible Shrinking Man. So this guy was on a boat, and then he went through a radioactive cloud, and it caused him to shrink and shrink and shrink. So when he was big, he could do certain things, but when he was smaller, he could do really different things. So by changing the size of the person, you change the way they could behave. And that's the same with food particles. If you make them very small, they behave very differently in food and in our bodies. And just to give you an idea of how small nanoparticles are, if you look at the planet Earth and you compare it to the size of a pumpkin, it's about 10 million times. The pumpkin's about 10 million times smaller than planet Earth. If you look at one of the nanoparticles that we're working with, it's about 10 million times smaller than a pumpkin. So that just gives you an idea of how tiny these particles are that we're working with. And once they get to this very, very small size, they behave very differently than regular food ingredients. So we've looked at like the good and the bad of nanoparticles in food. So some of the good things about nanoparticles is you can use them to fortify foods. So for example, if you're trying to put a hydrophobic vitamin like vitamin A or vitamin D into a watery drink, you can encapsulate them in these tiny particles, and then you can disperse them in these products, and they'll stay stable for months or years and have a really high bioavailability. You can enhance the functional performance of biodegradable packaging, or you can create antimicrobials that work much better by making the particles very, very small, because the small particles can penetrate into the bacteria much more easily. So I'll just give you one example. So we've done a lot of work on bioavailability. So this is an example where we go from nano to nano to nano. So what we do is we create these nanoparticles in food using a technique called microfluidization. So we make these little particles and then put them into the food product. And we encapsulate hydrophobic materials inside of here. When they get digested in the gastrointestinal tract, these particles get broken down and they form new types of nanoparticles. Oh, great. Thank you very much. They form new forms of nanoparticles in the gastrointestinal tract. So these are called micelles. And these micelles are really important because they solubilize vitamins and nutraceuticals and then transport them to our epithelial cells. And then once they get to the epithelial cells, these nanoparticles get absorbed and then they get processed inside the cells and produce these things called chylomicrons or lipoproteins. So these are also nanoparticles. So we've gone from like nanoparticles in the food to nanoparticles in the gut to nanoparticles in our bloodstream. So if we can control this process, we can increase the efficacy of different types of bioactive components that we put into these foods. And just give you one example, this is some in vitro experiments where we took sort of fat droplets and we made them at different sizes. So we have the same amount of fat present, but we make them from large to medium to small. And you can see that as you make the particles smaller, the bioavailability or bioaccessibility of the carotenoid, which is encapsulated in them, increases. So by making them smaller, so nanosizing ingredients, you've made them much more, the bioavailability much higher. And the reason for that is because as you make them smaller, they have a bigger surface area. So enzymes can absorb to them more rapidly. So that means they get digested more quickly in your small intestine. So that releases more of the vitamins or nutraceuticals and also forms more of these mixed micelles which can actually solubilize and transport these vitamins and minerals. But it's not just the size of the particles that's important, it's also what the particles are made out of. So here we made 3 nanoparticles, which all had the same size and concentration, but they were made out of different food oils. So one of them was made out of corn oil, one was made out of MCT, which is like coconut oil, and one was made out of orange oil. So everything's the same apart from the type of oil we used. And you can see in this case, you've got a very high bioavailability, whereas in this case, you've got almost no bioavailability. And this is because we're trying to encapsulate a carotenoid, beta-carotene, which is a very long hydrophobic molecule. And the mixed micelles formed from these particles are too small for this to fit into. Whereas if you've got corn oil, this mixed micelle can fit inside of here, and therefore you get a much higher bioavailability. And this is actually being used in the food industry now, this technology, to try and deliver different types of bioactive components. And just to show you that you do get these mixed micelles formed, this is actually a transmission electron microscopy study. And you can see that you get these kind of structures formed, and you can actually measure the distance of these structures. So you can see whether your molecule can actually fit in here. So you can actually design the structures in your gastrointestinal tract to increase the bioavailability of different types of molecules you've consumed. So they were all in vitro studies. We've also done some in vivo studies with Professor Park in our department and shown that you can see the same kind of effects. As you get smaller particles, you increase the bioavailability. And if you use a non-digestible particle, you get a much lower bioavailability. So the size of the particle is important, but also what they're made of. So that was some of the sort of good things about nanotechnology. There's also bad things about nanotechnology. So as you shrink something to a much smaller size, it faces very different challenges. And if you're big, you can step on a spider. If you're very, very small, you might have to fight a spider with a pin, and hopefully, it doesn't catch you in the web and eat you. So there's new challenges when you make things very, very small. So we did some work with titanium dioxide. And titanium dioxide is a type of nanoparticle that is commonly used in foods as a lightening agent. So it's often used in sort of confectionery products to give them like a nice sort of whitish appearance. And actually I did my first sort of major TV appearance last year on CBS News, where they interviewed me about titanium dioxide in food. It was an absolute harrowing experience. I was all set up on my computer, ready to go, and then it stopped working. Like 5 minutes before the interview started, and I was just panicking like crazy, and it was delayed, and eventually I got on there, but I was very I was a bit rattled by the time I got on there. But anyway, you've got these nanoparticles in these kind of food products, and these are commonly consumed by children. So, there's some estimates that children get quite high levels of these titanium dioxide nanoparticles. So what me and other colleagues in our department have done is like looking at different types of food nanoparticles, which can have different sizes and shapes and charges and compositions, and trying to see like what characteristics of nanoparticles makes them healthy or unhealthy. So we used an in vitro digestion model, and we looked at the behavior of nanoparticles in the gastrointestinal tract. So what happens when they move from the mouth to the stomach to the small intestine? So most people previously would just take nanoparticles and then they would like put them on cells and see if they're absorbed. But this is not what the body sees. You know, if you eat foods, it goes through the digestive tract. And it's really important to take that into account because it changes the characteristics of the particles. It changes their interfacial composition, it changes their size, it changes their aggregation state. So if you really want to understand how particles get absorbed by your body, you have to take into account gastrointestinal effects and food matrix effects. So we wrote some key articles in that area. The other good thing, other thing I should mention is if you want to do good work, find good collaborators. That's really, really important. And I'm really lucky in the food science department. We have fantastic professors. We have everyone in the department's doing amazing work. And I've worked with most people in our department. And Hong Zhao I've worked with for years, and he's an absolute genius. It's something, nothing phases him. He'll learn any new technique he needs to solve the problems he's working on. So we did some work with him on sort of food nanoparticles, on titanium dioxide and other kind of particles. And he was looking at the effect of dietary composition. So if you have titanium dioxide particles, you could either have them with a low-fat diet or a high-fat diet. And what we found is, if you had them with a high-fat diet, they behave very differently than if you have them with a low-fat diet. So this was the effect of the nanoparticles on one of the bacteria that lives in the colon of these rats. And this lactobacillus is a good bacteria. So the more lactobacillus you have in your colon, the better it is for your health. But what they found is if you had these titanium dioxide nanoparticles, it actually killed a lot of these beneficial bacteria. So again, the higher the fat content, the worse the effect. So again, this is really important work that's showing that the toxicity of nanoparticles depends on the kind of food that you eat them with, as well as the characteristics of the nanoparticles themselves. So if you're on a high-fat diet or you're obese, you're going to be more affected by this. So the summary of that work was that consuming titanium dioxide nanoparticles can adversely affect the gut microbiota, and that could have severe health consequences. And actually, they've banned titanium dioxide nanoparticles in France now, and they've banned them in all of Europe, and I think they're working on doing that as well in the United States because of the adverse effects that they have. So I was telling my mother about this research, and she was, she said, "Oh, that's interesting. Like the biggest titanium dioxide factory in the world is based in Billingham, Teesside, which is where I come from." So that was really weird. And I thought, all this research I'm doing is going to put everybody out of work. And there's already massive unemployment where I live, so it's probably not great. So the other really big thing that changed my career recently was a book that my wife bought. So my wife, the back there, so she bought me this book for Christmas called A Cracking Creation. And it was written by Jennifer Doudna. So she was a professor from California, and she was the person who discovered CRISPR. And she wrote this really nice popular science book on CRISPR. And I read it and I thought, oh, that's an absolutely fantastic book. And I told my daughter about it, because my daughter was working in my lab. And she was saying, well, why didn't you write a book, Dad, about food science? It's a really interesting area. Nobody's done it before. And I said, yeah, it's a great idea. I'll do that. Because my daughter, she's a real inspiration like that. She's always come up with good ideas. So I wrote this Future Foods book. And when I was doing the research for that, it completely changed my impression of food science, or my overall feeling for food science. I'd been working in nanotechnology. My career had been focusing on smaller and smaller and smaller things. And when I was writing this book, I had to look at the whole world around me. And what I found is, food has a huge impact on all aspects of our life. It affects our health and well-being. What we eat is affecting things like chronic diseases like obesity and cancer and heart disease and stroke. It affects sustainability. Like the crops we grow, the animals that we raise will affect things like greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. It affects the safety. Lots of people die every year from eating food that's contaminated with pathogenic bacteria. So what we want to do is we want to make safe foods that are nutritious and good for the environment, but they also have to taste good. There's no point making healthy and sustainable foods if they taste bad. So it's incredibly complicated to solve all of these big problems. And we need scientists from all sorts of different areas to do this. So physicists, chemists, biologists, psychologists, social scientists. So it's a really fascinating area to work in. And the other thing I found when I was doing research for this book is just like all the interesting new technologies that were being applied to foods. So in our lab, we were doing things like food architecture and nanotechnology and gastrointestinal behavior. But there was also things, like gene editing and metabolomics, artificial intelligence, robotics, additive manufacturing. All these new technologies were being applied to foods and really transforming how we created foods and made them healthier and more sustainable. One of the things that really impacted me was this paper that was published in Science in 2018 by a professor from Oxford University, Joseph Puer. And he did a really comprehensive survey of the whole food system and looked at all the environmental impacts of all the different foods that were produced around the world. And what it really highlighted was that the food industry is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, water use, land use, pollution, and all sorts of other negative effects on the environment. But by far the worst thing was meat production, and especially production of cows. So we really, as the global population expands and people become richer and they want to have a more protein-rich diet, we really need to eat less meat in our diet. So that caused me to change my research from really focusing on the nanotechnology to trying to look at creating these more healthy and sustainable foods, which were made out of plant-based ingredients. So things like dairy products, meat and seafood and egg products. And one of the big emphases of the research that we did was really focusing on the healthiness of these foods. So it's often consumed that if you go from an animal-based diet to a plant-based one, you're going to be healthier. But these studies are going from eating meat to eating sort of fresh fruits and vegetables. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about substituting burgers and egg and other products with highly processed plant-based alternatives. So the question is, if we switch from this kind of food to the plant-based alternatives, is that really healthy for you? And that really depends on how we formulate these foods. And just to give you some examples, this is like a plant-based salmon. And if you look at the nutrition label, it's got almost no protein in it. And it's got very little omega-3 fatty acids in. So you've gone from a really healthy salmon product to a really unhealthy plant-based product. And the same with cheese. Cheese has normally got something like 20% protein in. This has got almost 0% protein in. And it's probably got less vitamins and minerals in. And you've got a much more complicated label. So if you went from real cheese to this product, it's probably going to be much less healthy for you. It's probably better for the environment, but much less healthy for yourself. But it is possible to make plant-based cheeses that are healthy. So this is somebody I work with in... He's started a food company in California. So he did an astrophysics degree in Harvard, and then he went to work for SpaceX making spaceships, and then he went to work for Google. And after that, he got sick of the corporate world and decided he wanted to start his own business. So he started this company to make plant-based cheeses using artificial intelligence. And these are some of the products that he made. So I tasted these products when I visited him in California. And these are really fantastic products, and they're actually made to have the right nutritional composition. So they've got the same amount of protein and vitamins and minerals as you would get from cheese. So you wouldn't get the adverse health effects, and you get a very big benefit from a sustainability point of view. So what we're trying to do is, trying to control the nutrient composition of these plant-based foods. We're trying to fortify them with healthy ingredients like vitamins and minerals and probiotics. And we're also trying to control things like the digestibility of the ingredients in these plant-based foods and the bioavailability to make sure that you don't get like a big spike of glucose in your bloodstream that leads to diabetes. Or, if you do have vitamins and minerals there, they're actually going to be bioavailable so that they can actually have the health benefits that I claim for them. So I'll give you one example that I've commonly used is like creating these plant-based seafood. So this is a plant-based scallop. So what we wanted to do is create a plant-based product that would mimic the characteristics of a real scallop. And this was, so when you formulate these products, again, the science is incredibly complicated. You have to control how light waves are scattered from them because that determines the appearance. You have to control the molecules, the volatile molecules that come into your nose and that interact with your tongue. You have to control the structure to get the right texture and mouthfeel. So it's very, very complicated science in formulating these products. So we've been using like soft matter physics approaches, and this is some of the work that the students working in my lab are doing now. So for example, we made these plant-based scallops from peas, like pea proteins, and pectin, which is from oranges. And if you mix them together, they spontaneously phase separate. And then if you blend them, you get these fibrous structures. And then you can gel it to get these fibrous structures in place. And then you can make something that looks like a scallop. And I should say that I showed this picture to my wife, I showed this picture to my wife, who sat at the back there, and I said, oh, this is interesting, one of my students created that. And she said, oh, that looks just like a scallop. And I think, oh, does it? So then we called it a scallop, and then compared it with a real scallop. So it seemed like we were actually trying to make scallop, but actually we were making something completely different. So again, I think that's typical in science, is you start off doing one thing, and then you end up doing something really different, because you find out something, it goes in a different direction than you intended it to go in. But anyway, it shows that you can make something that sort of looks and has a texture very similar to like an animal-based one. And then we've looked at like how, compared how real scallops and plant-based ones behave in the gastrointestinal tract. We've looked at how they get broken down in the mouth, stomach, and small intestine. And you can see it's fairly similar. And then we've looked at the sort of digestibility. So this is like the protein digestibility. And you can see that for the real scallop, you actually get more protein digestibility than the plant-based one. So even though they've got the same protein content, you get more proteins from the real scallop. So that's, that could have important nutritional consequences. So I'm going to skip through some of this. So I'm just going to quickly go through this because it's been quite a long time. So we've done, we've also worked on like plant-based milks, and we're trying to make sort of biomimetic milks that behave just like real milk. We've been fortifying these plant-based milks, and we can show that we can increase vitamin bioavailability using them. We've made plant-based eggs. Again, it's complicated science behind that. So this is like some of the plant-based eggs we've made. And one of the things we're trying to do with that is do with like this idea of personalized nutrition, is can we fortify these plant-based eggs with nutrients that might be missing from the diet. So this is, I was talking to my optician the other day about macular degeneration, and she was saying she had a patient who just went blind, like almost overnight. And this guy had been planning his whole life to go to Rome. And just as he bought a ticket to go to Rome, and just as he was going, like traveling there, he lost his sight. He got macular degeneration. So you imagine like trying to see the Colosseum, looking out of eyes, that's what you can see. And this happens to lots of people when they get older, like in your 70s and 80s. And one of the reasons for that is a lack of a carotenoid called lutein in the back of your eye. And this acts like a natural sunscreen and an antioxidant that protects your eye. So what we've been trying to do is fortify these plant-based eggs with lutein so that you can give it to people as they get older and make sure that it's bioavailable to try and stop this disease. So this idea of personalized nutrition. Yeah, and one of the big criticisms of plant-based foods recently is that they're ultra-processed foods. And they are ultra-processed foods. They contain lots of different ingredients. They're very highly processed. So what we're trying to work on now is making these what's called hybrid foods. So instead of just using plant-based ingredients, is mixing plant-based ingredients with other kinds of ingredients to try and make a hybrid product where you need less overall ingredients and less processing. And just to give you one example, this is where we've taken proteins and mycelium. So mycelium are sort of like a living organism that you can grow up in a bioreactor. So, and they've got like a naturally fibrous structure, and they contain lots of vitamins and minerals, so you don't have to add that. But they can't form a gel on their own. So what we do is we mix them with potato protein, you can form a nice gel, and these provide the vitamins and minerals and structure. So by combining them together, you can make a nutritious product that's got the right texture, but much less ingredients in. So I think this is going to be the future. And actually interesting, the factory, the biggest factory in the world that makes mycelium is based in Billingham, in the UK. So I actually visited it last year, and this guy took me around the factory. So that was really cool as well. So I started this saying, you know, like I've had a really fantastic career in food science, and a lot of that is down to UMass. UMass is a brilliant place to work. I've got fantastic colleagues, the administration's great. It's a lovely area to live in, so I'm really, really, really glad that I've spent my career here. You know, what am I going to work on next? I think probably the next thing I'll work on is like redesigning ultra-processed foods. So it's said like the food industry's been incredibly successful over the last 100 years, creating really cheap, affordable, delicious foods, but they've ignored some really important parts of foods. So I think in the future, we've got to make foods taste good, we've got to be cheap, they've got to be convenient or people don't buy them. But we've also got to think of like ethics, resilience, sustainability and health, and we've got to design that into foods right at the beginning. So just to finish, I'd just really like to thank all the students and postdocs and visiting scholars who've worked in my lab. This is from probably a couple of years ago now, but I've always had amazing students and they're really inspiring and they do all the hard work. I get a lot of the credit, but it's those people who do the work. And then the last thing, is just thank my family. So this is my wife and me, like in 1992 when we first went to California. This was in Death Valley. My wife, she was much hipper than me, so I was really lucky to catch such a lovely lady. And we've had 30 lovely years living in Massachusetts. So this is my daughter. So family is incredibly important as well, and they've really supported me. If it wasn't for them, I couldn't have achieved what I've achieved. So thank you very, very much for listening. I know that was quite a long talk.
When you said Star Trek, I was about to jump, but then nobody reacted, and I didn't want to expose my science fiction nerdiness to this. But you also got me when you said UMass Amherst has a great administration, so thank you for that.
It's true.
You know, what you've seen today is the best that UMass Amherst has to offer. What was packed in this talk was a master researcher and a master teacher. There were a lot of messages here, a lot of lessons for young students and postdocs, a lot of nuggets that should really guide you as you move forward, as well as the excitement of science and this continuous moving from one challenge to the next that was communicated to you today in English, thank you, as compared to being drowned by the technical details. And the most important thing today was everything said here had the healthy science skepticism about the challenges that we could face. And that's what we need moving forward. And after you see work like this, you understand why we have the #1 food science department in this nation, probably the world. And that is why we have forces on this campus, like Julie and his colleagues, Dean Fox, Dean Ana Maria Ciagariz, our Vice Chancellor for Research, who are thinking about how UMass Amherst will lead the future of food. And they're thinking really hard about it and thinking how can we take this by the rein and sort of move forward. So I want to thank you for this amazing work and congratulate you again. We now have a few minutes to ask some questions. I'll let you orchestrate that, okay, but I want to say our colleagues are here. If you're interested in asking a question, they have a mic to get to you, and I leave you to sort of come back.
Thank you.
When you think about ethics in the future of food, what's your short list? And what's your lay of the land? That's like a whole lecture in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think there's all sorts of different ethical aspects. I mean, there's the animal welfare aspect is obviously a big one if you're vegetarian or vegan. I mean, there's like 90 billion animals killed per year for food that are kept in really terrible conditions. But there's also like the human ethics of, who produces who grows the crops, who works in the abattoirs and the farms and things like that, and actually paying people properly throughout the food system. And who decides what we get to eat? Is it multinational corporations that decide everything we eat? Or, how much say do consumers have in the quality and sustainability of the diets that you have? So I think, it's a very complicated issue, which is a whole other lecture, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. McClements. I was wondering if you could tell us about what is the technology that you're most excited to see that you're not working on, that you are excited to see people work on in the future of the food industry and food science?
I mean, I think genetics, I was terrible at biology, and partly because they had a Latin teacher in my secondary school, and they had no students to go to take Latin, so they took all the people who were good at science and put them in the Latin class, so I never got to do biology, and I was terrible at Latin. But I think like genetic engineering and stuff like that, I'd love to see more work on genetic engineering, because I think we really need it if we want to respond to climate change. We can engineer foods to be more resilient to salt or heat or drought. We can engineer them to make healthier ingredients like high protein or higher omega-3 fatty acids. So I think for me that seems a really important area.
Hi, I'm Sashan. You spoke about food, like ultra-processed foods being not too acceptable in the market. But my question is, if something is really ultra-processed, is it bad? Because a lot of the plant-based meat products that are in the market have a lot of ingredients, but they also are play a huge role in the sustainability criteria. So is it really bad to have ultra-processed foods?
I think all the current generation of plant-based foods are ultra-processed, but I don't think that necessarily means they're bad. And I think you have to judge a food on its nutritional effects and its health effects. And you can have an ultra-processed food that is perfectly healthy for you. And there's some studies I think done in Stanford where they actually took a plant-based burger and an animal burger, and then they fed them to people for a few weeks, and then they looked at sort of biomarkers for different health aspects. And they found that the plant-based one, did have better health benefits. But then you're comparing a plant-based burger with a real burger. If you compare a plant-based burger with a chicken, you might get a different result. So I think, I don't think ultra-processed necessarily means it's bad. Yeah.
Hi, Julian. Thank you for a beautiful talk. I was wondering, along the lines of some of the other comments that we heard, what is it going to take in order to increase accessibility of these foods to the everyday person? Because we know that most of the plant-based alternatives are pricier. And so how can we make them more affordable in order to be able to have more people taste them and to actually convert their dietary habits?
Yeah, I think that's a huge problem at the moment. If you look at something like plant-based eggs, I think they're 3 or 4 times more expensive per unit amount than a real egg. So even though egg prices are going up, they're still not the same as a plant-based egg price. I think with the meat products, they're much more similar. But I think first of all, it's taste and convenience and affordability. If it doesn't, taste and convenience first, and then affordability is really important as well. But it depends on the populations. For middle-class people, it's probably taste and convenience. If you're coming from other areas where you've got less money, then obviously affordability is really, really challenging. So I think that's a big challenge, is how do we get cheaper ingredients and cheaper processes to make these? It's a work in progress, I think.
Thank you. Do you think the future of foods change the way people eat food in the first place? Would you imagine a world 10, 15 years down the line where there could be just one course of a meal a day, people just eat one thing once a day and be okay with it?
Yeah, no, when I was a kid growing up, there was people think that you just take a pill, you take one pill and then that would be enough. And the guy from the International Space Station, he was the commander of the International Space Station, and he was saying one of the most challenging things about being on the International Space Station was the food was so boring. So they would just get this mush that they had to eat every day, and it got really depressing. And I think you don't realise how what all the different roles that foods play in your life, like from a psychological point of view. So I think we'll never get to the stage where you just have a very boring, simple one meal a day, because food plays so many different cultural roles and in your life. One more question? Yeah.
I had, another question is, what do you think we need to do to get buy-in from consumers and the public to be more accepting of ultra-processed foods or other technology that's being implemented?
Yeah, great question. I suppose it really depends on I mean, I think it's going to be interesting as well because they're changing the government administration. We've got Kennedy in now, and he's very against ultra-processed foods. And I think I think he's got a point. So I think that it's really important that we change the type of processed foods that we have. But I think we need to get more studies like the Stanford studies that actually show that using hard empirical evidence, and then hopefully they get reported on the news and in the newspapers, so that more people can read them and learn about those kind of studies, that they're healthy for you and they're healthy for the environment. But they have to be affordable as well. If they're not affordable, nobody's going to buy them.
Hi, Julian, it's me. Yeah. Thank you for disseminating positive energy and knowledge to us for so long. This is a personal question. What attributes do you think are the most attributes to be a successful food scientist?
It's a passion for what you're doing, so like really enjoying it, I think is really, really important. Trying to be creative, and one of the most important things is get good collaborators. I think you can't do everything yourself, but if you can find, good people that you can work with, that can really take your science in a new direction.
Two more attributes, except passion.
Yeah, passion is important. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, first of all, I want to say thank you for talking about culture. I come from the Middle East. And I love it when people say you get the nutrients from Middle Eastern diet, you put them in a bottle and you drink, and you have Middle Eastern diet. And we forget families sitting together, enjoying leisurely food, or sourcing or cooking at home. So thank you for mentioning this. So thank you for your questions, thank you for your engagement. And at this time, on behalf of Chancellor Javier Reyes, who could not be with us today, he sends you his regards, it is my distinct pleasure to present you with the Chancellor's Medal, which is the highest honor that UMass Amherst bestows on our faculty. Congratulations.